How do you feel about justice and judgment?
Here at the Royal Courts of Justice in London, justice is served each and every day. The innocent are to be upheld, the guilty are to be punished. We love it when guilty people get what they deserve, don't we? I mean, just think how many books, TV programs and films have been made. Detective stories, crime thrillers, and of course, courtroom dramas, where the villain is finally found guilty and gets what is coming to them. There's an old saying, what goes around comes around. And it's a saying that is linked to this idea of justice. And it captures a basic desire of the human heart, which is this. We want to see justice done and people getting what they deserve, especially when we are the ones who have suffered because of what they have done to us. And this is how the Bible book of Obadiah begins. It begins with words that convey this sense of justice being served to those who deserve it. It begins with God announcing his intention to deal with wrongdoers and backstabbers. It begins with his promise of judgment.
Obadiah was a prophet who lived and served God's people around the time that Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians in 586 BC. Obadiah's message was for God's people, the Israelites. It concerned their national cousins, the Edomites, who betrayed them during the Babylonian invasion and cut them down in cold blood. Sometime later, God sent a message through Obadiah to the survivors of this terrible ordeal. And it is that message that we have in our Bible as the book of Obadiah. God's message begins with these words.
The vision of Obadiah. This is what the sovereign Lord says about Edom. We have heard a message from the Lord. An envoy was sent to the nations to say, "Rise, let us go against her for battle. See, I will make you small among the nations. You will be utterly despised. The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rocks and make your home on the heights. You who say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? Though you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord."
Right from the beginning, we get a clear sense of the Edomites and what God thinks about them. We're okay. We're safe, they were saying to themselves. No one can touch us. No one can threaten us. After all, who can bring us down to the ground? You see, Edom was located to the south and the east of Israel, roughly where modern-day Jordan is today. It's an area of mostly rugged hill country and rocky mountains, easy to defend and almost impossible to take by force. And so that's why God speaks of them living in the clefts of the rock, making their home on the heights, soaring like the eagle, and making their nest among the stars. But the Edomites were fooling themselves. The pride in their own hearts had deceived them. They thought they were safe and secure, but they were not. They thought they were the ones with power and control over God's people. But the truth is, they were the ones that were facing his judgment. They were the ones that were on trial. Even with such strong defenses, God was going to bring them down. God was going to send other nations upon the Edomites in judgment, and their destruction was going to be absolute.
But how Esau will be ransacked, his hidden treasures pillaged. All your allies will force you to the border. Your friends will deceive and overpower you. Those who eat your bread will set a trap for you, but you will not detect it. In that day, declares the Lord, will I not destroy the wise men of Edom, those of understanding in the mountains of Esau? Your warriors, Teman, will be terrified, and everyone in Esau's mountains will be cut down in the slaughter.
In these verses, God spells out that the Edomites were going to face complete political, economic, and social ruin. Everyone from their elite wise men and their warriors to the lowest citizens were going to be reduced to nothing. Sure enough, that is what happened in the years that followed. From around 550 BC to 300 BC, the Edomites were attacked by the Babylonians, invaded by Arab nations, and eventually completely conquered by the Nabateans, who came up from what we now know as Saudi Arabia. Today, there's pretty much nothing left of Edom apart from a few ruined forts and a small number of archaeological artifacts. Such was the completeness and severity of God's judgment against them. Now, to our 21st century ears, the judgment that God pronounced upon the Edomites may seem brutal, harsh, barbaric even. We might find ourselves asking, how could a God of love do that? Well, God gives us the reason for this judgment in the verses that follow.
Because of the violence against your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame. You will be destroyed forever. On the day you stood aloof while strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them.
What follows in Obadiah is a list of what the Edomites did that they should not have done. They include things like rejoicing over the disaster that Israel suffered, seizing the Israelites' property and wealth, and even waiting in ambush to cut down the people as they fled the Babylonians. But the overarching charge against the Edomites is this: when the godless and wicked Babylonians attacked and destroyed God's people, the Edomites were just like them. The Babylonians cut down the Israelites, and so did the Edomites. Therefore, God announces that the other nations were going to be sent to cut them down too. At this point, it's worth remembering that the vision given to Obadiah was a message for God's people, the Israelites. God wasn't so much warning the Edomites about their coming judgment, although he is doing that, but rather he is encouraging his people that judgment was coming and that justice would be done.
Today, we live a long time after the events of Obadiah. Yet, God's people still suffer injustice and ill treatment all around the world, even sometimes at the hands of those closest to us. People who should be our partners, our friends, our neighbours, and not our persecutors.
When we hear of such suffering, we do not need to despair. God knows the suffering of his people. When we ourselves are insulted, mistreated, or harmed for being a Christian, we can take comfort that God is keeping track of what is being done against us and will bring his judgment to bear on guilty people in his own time. And even if we experience the kind of betrayal and utter despair that the Israelites felt, perhaps if someone from our own family turns on us because we have turned to Christ, then do not lose heart. The Lord will see that justice is done and that people get what they deserve.
Even if God's judgment does not fall here and now, we know that there is a day coming when everyone who has ever lived will face the consequences of their actions before God. Back in Obadiah, God speaks of this ultimate day of justice and judgment like this.
The day of the Lord is near for all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your own head. Just as you drank on my holy hill, so all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and be as if they had never been.
In the Bible, this day of ultimate justice is called the Day of the Lord, and it is for all nations. That is, it is for everyone, everywhere.
As we've seen, the logic for God's judgment is simple. As you have done, it will be done to you. What goes around comes around. For the Edomites, this was bad news. They had turned on God's people, and so other nations would turn on them. They had cut down the Israelites, and so the Edomites would be cut down. But it was bad news for everyone else too. Just as the nations around Israel had ignored and rejected God, so the Lord would reject them as well. These are not careless words or idle threats. God's judgment upon the Edomites was real, serious, and certain. What he said would happen. But these words were for Edom and the nations through the Israelites. God was speaking to Israel to comfort them in their distress, but he also spoke through them so that they would announce this coming judgment to the people of Edom. As we have seen, from our vantage point, looking back through history, we can see that judgment did indeed come upon Edom, just as God said it would. But the judgment of God upon the Edomites was not the ultimate day of judgment foretold in the Bible. It was a day of the Lord, but not the day of the Lord. That final day is still coming. On the last day of human history, Jesus will raise everyone from the dead and judge all nations. He will effectively ask each one of us, what have you done for God? What did you do with God? I wonder, how would you answer those questions? For many of us, we need to be honest. We've spent our lives ignoring God and rejecting him. If so, then hear the warning of Obadiah. As you have done, it will be done to you. If you have lived your life disregarding God, then God will disregard you on that day. And if you've rejected God, then when Jesus comes, he will reject you. And even if we would call ourselves God's people, we would call ourselves Christians, we know that without Jesus, we too are just as deserving of this judgment as everyone else. But because of Jesus' death in our place, we have been spared that judgment. The world around us, though, is full of people who are living lives disregarding God and rejecting him as the God who made them. And the day is coming when God will judge them for what they have done. We know that day is sure and certain, but they don't. We also know that their only hope is to turn to Jesus and put their faith in his death and resurrection for them. But they don't. And so the question is, will we tell them? Will we warn them of that coming judgment, just as someone once warned us?
It is absolutely true that God is a God of love. But it's also true that he is the God of justice. When people reject the Lord and stand against him, when they put their hope in themselves or anything else other than God's goodness, when they reject him and maybe even turn on those who are his people, then God will eventually bring his judgment against them.
This is one half of the message spoken through Obadiah concerning the Edomites, and it is one half of the message spoken throughout the whole Bible concerning all of humanity. Thankfully, there is more to the message of Obadiah than just judgment, and next time we will hear words of great comfort and hope for all who turn to the Lord in repentance and faith. But for now, take time to consider the opening half of Obadiah for yourself. The Lord sees the betrayal, wrongdoing, and pain inflicted upon God's people by those who are against them. He knows the guilt that is on our hands and the pride that is in our hearts. He knows exactly what each one of us deserves.
Remember that saying, what goes around comes around? God's judgment is certain. The day of the Lord is coming.